as a poet, I feel I need to say I have really no idea what I'm talking about. Poets sort of mine the darkness. They discover things that they didn't know they knew. And that place where they go, and I think artists in general as well, is an unknown place. It's very Socratic in some ways. You know, Socrates said that the more he knew, the more he didn't know. And so I constantly feel that way as a poet. And so there's just inherent mystery. And the muse is ruthless. The muse is as well as generous. She provides inspiration and a poem, but then as soon as it's over, you feel as if you are need to get on to the next poem. And you often, at least I do, forget what I've just written in order to get to the new poem. So it's just a constant, enjoyable, but often kind of ruthless enterprise. Some of the inherent challenges that I want to talk about of poetry, too, before I start talking about some of these definitions, is in making or helping my readers see what I see once I get to that place of discovery, that unknown place. Degas said, it's not what you see as an artist, it's what you make the other, your reader or your viewer, see. So that's just a terrific challenge. And in order to get to that, or in order to succeed at that, it's important to immerse yourself in what John Keats called negative capability over and over again, which is being in that place, being in uncertainty, without any doubt, without any anxiety about where you are in that uncertainty, and then writing with what he called no irritable reaching. But if you're self-conscious about this, you know, it ruins the poem often. So with that disclaimer finished, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these famous definitions of poetry, and then read a few of my poems as a kind of literal and imaginative biography of my own life as a poet, who was really less interested in finding more definitions of poetry than I am in writing the next poem. So let me start with Robert Frost's wonderful sort of thought on our definition of poetry here, or thinking about it. A poem begins with a lump in the throat, a homesickness, or a lovesickness. It is a reaching out toward expression, an effort to find fulfillment. And this is the sentence I love. A complete poem is one where an emotion has found its thought, and the thought has found words. I love the fact that he starts with emotion there, emotion finding thought, rather than the thought finding the emotion, and then the thought finding the words. So a wonderful example of that, and there are thousands and thousands, but the one I settled on, a poetic example for that definition, is Emily Dickinson's poem 398, where she begins, I had not minded walls, were universe, one rock, and far I heard his silver call, the other side the block. I tunneled till my groove pushed sudden through to his, and then my face took its recompense, the looking in his eyes. So she's responding to that, to the other, to the beloved across the street, with that lump in her throat, a lovesickness there. Best words in the best order, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. I don't think there's a more succinct definition of poetry than that. It's hard to, it's so simple, and yet try to do it. I thought of a poem by Catullus as an example for this. I love and I hate. You may ask how this is possible. I have no idea, but it's happening right now, and it hurts. That's it. Written in the 4th century BC. The news that stays news. Of course, Ezra Pound said that in the early part of the 20th century. And that's true, whether it actually has to do with the news of the day, emotional news, human news of any sort. And so a stanza that I felt was really a wonderful example of that news that stays news, Yeats's Second Coming. Some of you may know this. It was written in 1921, but how amazingly pertinent it is to today. It's as news that stayed news. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Isn't that wonderful? It's news that stays news. Verbal music. This is just a definition I came up with, but after writing poetry for so long and trying to understand it as music that conveys meaning, this is something I certainly aspire toward myself in my own writing. But what greater example of a poet who achieves music than Gerard Manley Hopkins? Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple color as a brinded cow, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire cold finch's wings. So that alliteration and sprung rhythm that he wrote in, it was just so beautifully musical and memorable. Essential language. This is another phrase that I came up with. Someone just once asked me, what is poetry? And I just responded, it's essential language. It's that language that we go back to, whether poetically, politically, socially, personally, as language that is essential for us as human beings, whether it's language we use at a wedding or language that we use for elegy, as Abraham Lincoln did certainly in the Gettysburg Address. And the phrase or the stanza that I thought of for this as a wonderful example goes way back, 3,000 or more years to Gilgamesh, when after Gilgamesh has witnessed his close friend Enkidu dying and says these beautiful words, all that is left to one who grieves is convalescence, no change of heart or spiritual conversion, for the heart has changed and the spirit has converted to a thing that sees how much it costs to lose a friend it loved. Memorable speech. This is W.H. Auden's famous definition of poetry. And of course, you could pick practically any poem that has endured as memorable speech. One that just popped into my head was Dylan Thomas's beautiful poem, "In my craft or sullen art, exercised in the still of night, when only lovers lie abed with all their griefs in their arms, I labor by singing light, not for ambition or bread, or for the strut and trade of charms on ivory stages, but for the common wages of their most secret heart." First stanza of that beautiful poem. And prayers to the unsayable. The more and more I write, the more I realize, and the more I actually hear from other poets who've written for a long time. Philip Levine, who just died recently, makes this point in his beautiful poem, "The Simple Truth." And Walt Whitman also in his Canto 5, in which he's addressing his soul. Poets finally realize that the reason that they need to write the next poem is because the last poem is only an approximation of that perfect poem, the unsayable, the silence. So there's this dialectic that's always going on in poets between what they write, whether it's the Divine Comedy or a little lyric like Catullus, that it's the unsayable, it's the mystery of that unsayable, that unknowable place that I mentioned earlier. And a prayer to the unsayable, I think the best example I can think of is maybe Walt Whitman's, again, that fifth canto in his Song of Myself, where he says, come loaf with me in the grass, loose the stop from your throat. Not music, not words or rhyme I want, not lecture or custom, not even the best. Only the lull I like, the hum of your veiled voice, that unsayable. I think we have maybe one more down below, or is that at the end? Okay, there are a lot more that just are swimming through my head. But those are just some examples of wonderful definitions of poetry that I think in this day and age we might forget. We're so consumed with our the information in this age. And unfortunately, I noticed this with some of my students, concentrate more on information today than this memorable language, which is the language which is diachronic, which has passed through time since the beginning of time, as definitions, as stories, as dramas that have defined us as human beings. So I thought I would end with just by reading about 5 or 6 poems, again, that trace my sort of biography, my course of writing from fairly early on to the present, starting with some childhood poems, 1 or 2, and then moving on to more adult poems. I grew up in southwestern Virginia, so I used to ride these huge Percheron horses bareback with my sister. So I wrote this about that. The Percherons. My sister and I went out to them with sugar cubes, bridled their heads when they bent down to eat from our palms. We led them over to the long white fence on which we climbed to the topmost rail, then threw our legs across their backs, clutching the reins to steady ourselves against their girth, steering them out into the hills until we were lost, or thought we were, only to find ourselves at Judith Creek or Holcomb Rock, where we'd turned back in the early dark, gripping their manes, crouching low, galloping hard on the high, soft road across the field to the open barns. This next poem is about our farmer who mows his field at night with this huge farm-all, those old farm-alls. And as I lay in bed listening to him mow his fields at night with those huge lights, just somehow that sound takes me back to the fields where I grew up. So it confused me. It ended up confusing me about time itself, and how just malleable and transcendent it can be. Night mowing, this is called. It's got a little epigraph here. Memory is a kind of accomplishment. It's a quote by William Carlos Williams. Memory is a kind of accomplishment, which I realize more and more the older I get here. I remember the drone of Francis Temple's farm-all moving in the dark of a mid-September night. Its deep, desultory blasts were also guttural, half motor, half cat, as it labored in the meadow, back and forth, felling hay in 6-foot rows with a sickle bar that rattled like a snake. The memory of that mowing grows in my mind, which is also a field that's overgrown with every weed and type of grass, no less real than the tractor itself, mowing in the dark. I wake with a start to the sound of the engine, the same old farm-all I heard as a boy, so that I am forever waking and remembering at the same time to the accompaniment of a tractor I cannot see in the meadow, but know is there, as it is tonight, 30 years later, growing newer instead of older, as it takes me back and it's moving forward down the rows of waist-high hay that fall like hair against the earth. Now, this next poem was my attempt to write a memoir in verse. And it's a short poem. A lot of poets are writing their memoirs today, and in prose, long books, and then they can't get back to the poetry. So I've written a short memoir here in verse. Memoir. I willed the knife to hit the mark, and it did. sometimes at the point and stuck. Practice led to skill until my eyes were covered with a handkerchief, and my beloved straddled a wheel for all to see as I threw at her to hit the space between her legs, beside her head, beneath her arms. This was it, all or nothing, my life and hers in a mortal act, where every night she was reprieved for having lived, and I was kissed as she was freed as part of the act that traveled the country and built my fame as the man who misses with perfect aim. Thank you. Just a few more here. This is how I feel every morning when I get up. And who the heck am I? And who is dressing me, for crying out loud? My mother always put out clothes when I was a child, and I had to wear those clothes. And so even though I put on my own clothes now, I still think of those clothes that were always laid out for me. And then that leads to, well, how did that affect my sense of self and so on? What a doll am I? I rise naked each morning and stand at the window with arms outstretched and feet apart like Da Vinci's figure in the circle, and wait for the day's attendants to dress me in garments they choose for that morning. A shroud one day, a coat of lead the next. What a doll am I to these attendants, whose only task is to remind me day after day of who I am, the man or woman I think I'm not. Here's a short one. In the brief time we have left, let the ant cross the table. There's another line I wanted to make sure I have just right there. Let the ant cross the table. Give me a kiss. Give me another kiss. That's it. Two more. This is a poem titled Frog. It's a myth. My tongue leapt out of my mouth when I lied to her and hopped away to the stream below the house. Mute then, I started to write the truth. My tongue turned wild in the stream, for which I was glad and unashamed. I listen now from my porch to the complex things it says in the distance about my heart. How hard it is to tell the truth inside my mouth. How much it needs to sing in the dark. Sunday calls. There's a reference in this poem to a lake called Bad Medicine. In northern Minnesota, the Ojibwe there have named lakes that have neither an inlet or an outlet, Bad Medicine, because they believed that a healthy lake had both. So even though the lake might have fish and be clear, and it's still bad medicine because it has no inlet or outlet. Sunday calls. The nurse calls to tell me on Sunday evenings how he's doing, how he's holding his own in front of the window with 1,000 channels behind the one that saves his screen with snow, fish houses, and eagles. How the days hang above the ice as vast recycled pages on which he writes in invisible ink. How the sun arcs across the sky, then breaks like a plate above the horizon. How the temperature drops below zero at dusk, then continues to fall till morning. In this way, she teaches me how to speak to him in his sleep at his home in Minnesota, which is the same, she says, as talking to a friend you've never met, but grown close to nonetheless from hearing his voice. I hear the snow falling as she holds the phone outside the window, Silence is the sound of snow falling on snow, I think, as I listen to the flakes inside the air before she closes the window. I'm thinking of walleye in their sleep, I tell my father, of catching them as they dream, then throwing them back in the hole I drilled by hand with the auger you gave me as a child, whose handle is stained with blood from my turning it so many times into the ice of bad medicine. I wait for her voice to return, then say, just this for now, since any more would disappear the lake inside his head on which he builds a house for us to fish throughout the winter. Now this last poem is a kind of ars poetica. Why I write the homage, I guess, I want to pay, the prayer I want to say to the unsayable. So I thought it might be appropriate to end with this. It's called To Hear and Hear. We live in Vermont. We hear these beautiful thrush in our woods, the hermit thrush, which is the state bird. To hear and hear. The hermit thrush is set for 6 to sing his song, as if it were the end of the world, and he was stirred by dusk to sing the same sweet song again and again in the understory, as if to say, it's neither words nor meaning that matters in the end, but the quality of sound, as if we were deafened by the sun and needed his song as a key to unlock our ears, to hear and hear and understand, to see and see, knowing that this one day is the end for now, which it is, he claims, with a song just loud enough to pierce the woods until the night descends like 1,000 veils, and then just one. Thank you.